Welcome to Festival of Ideas Online. I'm Andrew Kelly, Director of the festival and also Director of our Festival of the Future City. We're joined today by architect and writer Marwa al-Sabouni. Marwa is the author of The Battle for Home, the memoir of a Syrian architect, and now Building for Hope, Towards an Architecture of Belonging. Both of these books mean a lot to us in our work on the future of cities, and we've been honoured to have Marwa as a guest in our Festival of the Future City and again today. In 2019, Marwa was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers in Prospect magazine. It's a brilliant book, and I should also add, it contains some of Marwa's wonderful illustrations of the places she's visited, and we'll be showing some of those illustrations during the event today. Marwa, your first book was about your life and work in Syria. Here you travel more widely and have been able to see how other cities work. Like you, we're interested in how cities best work, why they fail, how we can ensure a good life for all in cities. At the moment, some cities, like your own, are trying to recover from conflict. Other cities are looking what they do after the pandemic. You write about the many lessons you've learned from cities like Bristol, Detroit, Amsterdam, Damascus, and Beirut. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you, Andrew, for having me and for this introduction. Yes, the idea of belonging basically comes to fore from in the situation that I live in, because as you may hear, a lot of people here were forced to be displaced and to leave home, and of course that's due to conflict and war. But again, from conversations and from what you hear from people, it's just the loss of home is very evident, and this idea of how to belong to a place, what does it mean to have a place and you sort of have loyalty to that place, and why it's important was of interest for me. So yes, the first thought that comes to mind is, of course, safety, because it's like I discussed in Building for Hope, is just it's the primal fear that we have as human beings, that we want to ensure our survival, and the fear of death is something that is built in our nature. So to have a place that you could feel safe and secure is basically the essential thing to have in your relationship to a place and to belong to a place. But then what I build on this idea is just how many layers above that do we need in order to feel belonged to a place. And this is something that I noticed, like you said, when I traveled along, that I felt that we share as human beings in this era, we share this loss. We share this loss of this sense of belonging to a place for a number of reasons. And that's what I try to discuss in both books. But the first book was about a local experience, like I said. It's just something that in Syria and in my city and the destruction of it. But then when in Building for Hope, it's more of a global scope.
We'll come back to the 5 fears that you've identified in a moment, but I also wanted to ask you right up front about the role of architecture. You talk about architecture abandoning its prime task of promoting Omran. Could you talk about that for us?
Yes. So the word that you are saying, it's an Arabic term, and it's a concept that was discussed first by a Muslim thinker from the 14th century, who is Ibn Khaldun, which I think is a figure that also is known for you in the Western culture. And Ibn Khaldun was kind of like the first sociological thinker who thought about settlement, the idea of settlement, and the idea and the role of this idea in creating civilization. So in his words, in his concept, our utmost aspirations as human beings is to move from from the state of movement, which is a nomadic movement, and the tribal way of thinking and living, into the settled mode, which is, you know, when people settle down and start with the process that he calls Omran, which is Arabic word that I don't think there is an exact translation or exact word for it in English, but it combines the two meanings of urban with settlement. It's a physical process. It's something that you see built, but also it's something that you feel. So it's felt as well, and that's what interested me, because it's those two things that we have to balance between the built and the felt. The basic thing for us now, so what the prime observation, I think, is just that we are moving in a reversed way in our times. So we are moving from the urban settled mode, which is in Ibn Khaldun's understanding is the cause of civilization, into the movement, into the nomadic mode. So although we don't recognize ourselves as nomads, but if you thought about it, it's just, you know, we live the life of nomads in general. We are constantly on the move. We are constantly losing this sense of belonging to a place. And this has many risks and perils as well, as I discussed in the book, and as Ibn Khaldun showed it 6 or 7 centuries ago.
I mean, one of the great joys of the book is the learning you put forward from not just the cities you visited, but from Islamic culture, for example, and that really comes through the whole of the book. Let's talk about the 5 areas of vulnerability you've already which contribute to this sense of homelessness. You've talked a little bit about the fear of death. One of the things that you talk about in there is about how in certain you talk about, for example, the growth of deaths of despair, which is a term from the United States. What do you mean by the fear of death, and what that means for us in terms of belonging to a place?
The thing is, when I thought about the fears, it just, I kind of questioned our basic human nature, in a sense that when you assess something or object, a place or a building, whatever, it's just, if you stripped away the argument, if you went with the argument to the basic thing, why, for example, the question, why do I feel at ease with something, or I feel unsettled with something else, it's just the answers came across as 5 fears, like I describe in the book. So the primal fear is just, like I said, it's the fear of death, our instinct to seek survival. So it doesn't have to be, the word fear may be a strong word, because you are not constantly in a fear, but just if you as a human questioned your risk analysis for something, for example, it's just, it's about it revolves around your seeking survival. It's risky, I don't want to do it because it's harmful. In the end, I don't want to be harmed because I want to live, I want to survive. But when if you notice, when I discuss the fears, it's just they are in the backdrop, they are in the background of the text, and they are something that I come back to, like I said, is just as a basic discussion, as a basic reason. Why do I favor as a human being something on something else, and what do we mean by the word settlement in that sense? So after the fear of death comes the fear of need, which is related to economy and related to our living mode. And afterwards is the fear of treachery, which is also about trust, and why we need trust in communities and societies in order to thrive and in order to trade and do business. And the fourth fear is the fear of loneliness, which is also a fear that we struggle with, and a state that we struggle with in our modern times. And in the end, it's the fear of boredom. So those 5 chapters and those 5 fears are kind of, you know, what's holding the whole discussion together.
I want to pursue some of the ideas that come out of this before we move on to what we do about it. And the first is about this issue of need and particularly about the economy. And one of the things you're very critical of, and we're critical of as well, is how the economy has become quite badly skewed in cities towards towards wealth and so on. And you talk particularly about the rise and fall of the city of Detroit, for example, but you also compare it with the dead cities of Syria of some 13 centuries ago. How does a city rise? What's the problems when a city focuses on what you call the factory city?
Yeah, so the factory city is a symbol of the economy that you are describing, which is based on profitability. Just production for the sake of production, like I say in the book. It's not about production for the sake of like it was in older economies. It was production for the sake of multiple goals rather than just one goal. And that's the thing that I'm critical of when I'm describing the factory city. It's just because it employs people towards its own profit in that sense, and instead of having multiple goals which contribute in the cycle of thriving in the city and in the living and distribution of wealth in that sense, when it's come as exclusive as it is in the factory city and mass produced towards that, you call for people to come to labor forces from other places like the countryside, and you misbalance, you disrupt the balance that guaranteed the flow in the cycle. And that was in this sense I discussed the 3 modes of settlement, the nomadic, and the country, and the rural, and the urban. And I think you would notice from the discussion that the most affected mode of settlement is the rural, because the nomadic, you need some sort of restrictions around it, and I discussed why throughout history and to our modern times. And also the urban is just that keeps being filled and keeps being pursued by all people, also needs hindering, whereas those thrive on the nomadic, and the urban thrive on the expense of the rural, which is inevitably a risk to our survival as a human race.
And also you point one of the results of the factory city, which is one of the problems that a lot of cities face, including Bristol in some respects, is the growth of segregation, and how problematic that is for places for people to find as a home.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the excessive duplication that Jane Jacobs addresses in her work, I attribute that to the growth of our city. For example, city like Detroit and Homs, and of course all the factory cities, all the factory, which are big cities around the world, are based on of course ideas of globalization and massive trade and open trade and all of that. But there is nuances here I discussed, because I think for if you read it like that, it's just it sounds like it's anti-capitalist kind of thinking, which is not. I try to show that how both capitalism and socialism and communism failed because both deploy the idea of factory city for their own private ends, and we need to challenge that. We need to retrieve our economy and retrieve the policies of built environment into like the three modes of settlement that I speak about.
It's fair to say that you're as hard on the left as you are on the right in this book. We'll come back to this in terms of some of the solutions, because I think that there are small things that a city can do, and also big things. I mean, for example, one of the things you talk about, how the factory city often means to the rise of meanness. So you talk about spikes on buildings so birds can't perch on them and so on. And that's an example we've had actually in Bristol, where actually the spikes were put on tree branches, not just on buildings, which seemed particularly cruel, I thought. One thing who's meant a lot to us in our work in Bristol is Kevin Lynch, and you use Kevin Lynch's book, The Image of the City, in your work, particularly in talking about the notion of boundaries. And this comes into your next sphere, which is about treachery. Tell us a little bit about the notion of boundaries and how the important role they operate within places.
So Kevin Lynch speaks about the vacuum that happens in a sort of a type of boundary which he describes as the railways, or the loose end of the city, which could be a lake, a campus, any place that had no circulation. It doesn't bring the passenger or the commuter back into the city, and this is very true for all of our modern cities, because we had those massive structures, or also when it's more evident in the rigid zoning of cities, when you have a zone that is being segregated on the basis of functional thinking, and it gets isolated, and there you have the crime rises, and you have also the mental and the psychological effects on people because of this kind of loneliness and treacherous that it brings along. So the idea of boundaries, from where I look at it, is just how to find the balance between what is private and with what is public, and how to create a place that is not loose-ended but also not very confined and suffocated. I think it's a very important subject, because we tend to either to go to one of the extremes, either to lose boundaries altogether, or to just have very rigid boundaries, both in our planning and our also social thinking.
I thought it was very interesting when you referred to the public space in Islamic law, and also the European the allotment system, which we use over here as places for common good and spaces where people do come together and have to negotiate and collaborate how they live and work.
Yeah, the allotment example is just is something I think it's a very good example, a very good idea. To bring people together towards a productive end. So it's not just to hang out or to see people, which in the end, like I describe in the book, could end up into more of small zoning. So people come together or group together into isolated pods within a big public space, whereas with the allotment or with the market, Islamic market, for example, people comes towards a productive end in a public space, which creates all those relationships and sense of negotiation and introduction in relation that is discussed in relation to boundaries and how we approach each other and gain the trust of the other through this process.
I mean, trust is such a critical issue, really, in all the work that takes place where you bring people together. And certainly, if you look at some of the figures about who people trust and trust in decline, and often it's the health people at the top, and politicians fairly low down, really. I wanted to ask you about Bristol at this point, because you came to Bristol in 2019 and you very kindly wrote about the city in your book. And one of the wonderful illustrations, I should add that the book has 24 beautiful illustrations in, one of which is a lovely illustration of Bristol from the Avon. And I remember when you came to Bristol, you picked up our walking books that we did and chose to walk around the city. And I also remember you came back from that walk soaking wet. It was a very wet day, a bit like today. And I remember you were drenched, frankly, when you came back. And but what did you learn about Bristol as you walked around in terms of some of these things you're talking about?
Well, first of all, I found the book of walks that you made in your festival an amazing way to be introduced to the city as a different version from, you know, when we are placed as the visitors and we see the best face that the city could offer. You kind of gave us a map to look at the city throughout different perspectives, historical, functional, and from the perspective of different identities and all of that, and found it very fascinating and difficult to choose which walk I could fit in the schedule. When I learned about Bristol, what was very enjoyable for me in the walk is how connected the city is. So the small connections that enable the walk. So it's a city you could walk through, or you know, go and navigate different places. I found it very, very nice, and I contrast this with other city, which is Beirut, which is impossible to walk through. So I found myself going up by looking at the typology of the city. I was aiming at the bridge and I wanted to go high there, and my steps allowed me to go there even without, you know, much looking into the map. Whereas in other cities you feel disconnected, you feel those barriers which are urban barriers, and you look at a place which is very close to you, but you don't seem to find a way how to reach that place. And I discussed this in the book in terms of finding the exit. Both also I try to do this with the help of the fears, both mentally, psychologically, and aesthetically and functionally, in terms of the built environment perspective.
One of the great influences on the system, the map you used, was actually Kevin Lynch and his notion of legibility in cities, and we found that that's been one of the most useful things we've done over many years, actually, introducing that concept into our work. The next area I wanted to ask about, which is becoming a scourge of modern life, really, and is having all sorts of impact, which has been made much worsened by the pandemic, is this issue of loneliness. You talk about this in different ways, particularly about you know, some of the lessons you learned from Syria and so on. But you also refer to how the souk and the importance of that, and contrast it with the kind of the shopping centre you encountered in Oxford, the Westgate Centre. Talk us through a little bit about this and how things like the souk contribute to overcoming issues around loneliness, whereas a modern shopping centre wouldn't do so.
So the closest concept to connect to that is property issue in cities, and you can compare two venues together, like the souk and the shopping mall, which you could, at first sight, you could say no difference. So they are both covered markets, and they are both places, a public place with many contributors too. And so in function, and even sometimes in design, they are very close. But in reality, one, like you said, it just one contributes to loneliness, whereas the other is quite the opposite. And I think property here is the prime point that we should look at. In the souk, property is divided as small stakes to different people, to individual people, whereas in the shopping mall, it's one big stake that is owned by few people and rented to different lenders, and that contributes into a whole different economy and a whole different social experience, because in this shopping mall you have people who are employee, not owners, and this has a direct impact on how we do trade, basically, and how we do trade and how we approach the other, and how we are going to sell ourselves and our product is something that is related to how we live together and how we share economy and like we said, the sense of loneliness. We are no longer lonely in one society that is seeking profit from us, where we are contributors to a social relationship that is not based on like a benefit per se.
And this brings in, these of course are all linked together, aren't they? So, when you talk about that kind of transactional relationship, difference between a modern shopping mall and the souk, it does bring in issues around things like how you negotiate and talk to people, how you collaborate with people, how you trust people as well.
Exactly, and also you have to look at the life of the city, if we can call it like that. I mean, when small ownership is being threatened, and people who are small vendors or have independent work are no longer able to survive, which you touch firsthand in the pandemic now. Those people are the most vulnerable. They fell from the first hit. They couldn't survive. They couldn't. And even before that, the price of property that is going up and up and pushing people in that sense outside of the city and changing. It's kind of like a washing machine that keeps changing the faces, keep changing the people, and the minute that people feel that they formed relationships with some sense of community, which contributes to the idea of belonging that we were speaking about, the minute they feel starting to form those relationships, the city rotates them and kicks them off towards a further and further place.
Another issue around this is about the notion of locality and local. We've seen in a city like Bristol, and you see it in other cities as well, how local traders are pushed further and further out. You mentioned it already, they can't afford the high rental. But losing the local means you lose not just the trading, but also almost like the uniqueness of a place, don't you?
Exactly. You have no identity. And identity here is discussed through the production of people. And of course, this cultural product as well, how we deal with people, how we think, how we negotiate, and all of that is lost. Now we have cities that are designed for tourism. We have cities that are vacant. We have cities that have cities authorities that are discussing social housing and social housing schemes. All of those are outside of the city, whereas the city center, which grows bigger and bigger, is preserved for international wealth, and all of that happens on the expense of the countryside as well. We have to bring this issue back to the fore now, because it's our food that is being, and our environment and our climate that is being affected through this process. And we tend to just focus on how where we are going to place people in a box, the best box that we can now put for them, and we don't think about how people socialize and how people build trust and how people even eat food.
Well, I'll come on to the final fear now, which is the fear of boredom. I wanted to particularly ask you, you've talked a lot about property, and there was an article I read recently, which is on the RSA website, where you referred to property speculation, and also the very high price of property in parts of Syria, for example. And you talk in the book about it. You've got probably more chance of buying a home in Singapore or New York than Damascus.
Exactly.
Talk us through this notion of boredom and how issues like property and so on come into this.
So when you think about Syria, you don't necessarily think about high prices or expensive property. You would think that in a city like my city, 60% destroyed completely. You would think that okay, it's easy to find a home in the rubble, which is insanely not the case. It's still sells in the highest prices, most expensive property around the world. So Damascus was ranked among top 10 cities before the war, and it still is. And I don't get how a country that is washed out as our country after a decade of war still maintain this. We fell off every list possible in economy and education and happiness and welfare, but we still hold our place in the property market, which is insane. But again, it's related to how we compose the city and how it's being captive to the factory syndrome, like I describe in the book. And the fear of boredom is one of the fears that we don't discuss much, but also resonates with the pandemic now. And it's a fear that is related to death afterwards, because in boredom you just reach the point of having no meaning in life, and in that sense you don't pursue life any longer. And I discuss in the book the high rates of suicide that Western cities are witnessing, and it's all related to the loss of meaning. So if I have to say it in one sentence, is how we lost meaning throughout all the topics that we discussed now, and how we should seek that meaning again in order to make our cities live again.
Now, I want to come on to some of the solutions that you talk about. We're very keen on identifying solutions to some of these issues, and they are ones that, when, like you, I had the chance to visit a number of cities a few years ago before, when we could travel. And it struck me that the problems that faced a city like, for example, Melbourne, like Berlin and so on, they were very similar to problems that faced a city like Bristol. But often it was a difference of degree, sometimes an incredibly large difference of a degree. But one of the things that I found was that importance of locality and uniqueness, but also you mentioned it. I wanted to ask you specifically about this, but the importance of libraries to a place like a city. You talk about 2 libraries in this in Syria as part of this search for meaning. How important are they in terms of developing a sense of place and a sense of belonging to a place?
So the way I look at libraries is it's a garden for thought. So it's an equivalent of having a park in a city is to have a library, which is a cultural park. And in a country like Finland, for example, the two concepts merge together, which also a country that I discuss in the book at the end of the book. And in the case of Damascus, I compare two big libraries. So one is a modern library in after the model of a Western library, and the other one is an Islamic library. And I try to find meaning, like I said, find which building was more successful in maintaining meaning and in creating meaning in its place. For example, the way that the Islamic library was positioned, or the locality of it was built around the library in terms of having schools that contributed to the library, having houses around it, whereas the modern one is just it's like a monument. It's isolated and it lives its own life. Yeah, so I don't know which.
No. I mean, it's often. I mean, it's a small thing in a certain way in terms of rebuilding a place or building a place. But when libraries are, we're facing in this country a lot of closure of libraries, for example, and often these libraries were built around as part of the communities, the central parts of housing estates and so on. So they become not just a place, in your wonderful term, the garden for thought, but also a community centre where people can meet and exchange and chat and learn from each other and make friends and so on. It's just one small example. When you're in a city which is obviously got many different issues to ones that we face perhaps in this country. And I wanted to ask you about, you're not really looking, when you rebuild a city like Homs or a city in a kind of utopian city, are you?
No, but I need to comment back on the issue of the library, that the factory city hates libraries, as you are discussing now, because they are not built for profit. So they are the opposite example of a factory. They don't seek profit, they seek multiple goals, whereas the factory, that's why the factory city kicks out libraries out of the equation. So could you just repeat the question now you asked?
I wanted to ask you about the notion of utopia in cities, because what kind of city do you want to see rebuilt?
So yes, we both know that utopians do not exist. We are humans, and humans are destined to make mistakes. But the discussion is about how to minimize those mistakes to the degree that could guarantee our survival, because we took this idea for granted, and we gave ourselves free reign to committing mistakes and big mistakes towards our now threatening our the survival of the human race and the continuation of life on the surface of Earth. The climate problems, the climate change, and the environmental issues, and the housing, and the loss of home, and crime rates, and suicide rates. All of that is just plays into our understanding of how much mistakes are we allowed to make, and the book is about finding this sense of limitation around our mistakes. And I give to, like you said, I rely on Islamic history to help, to aid me in that mission. And I offer two solutions or experiments that prove to succeed, which is the Islamic endowment, the Waqf, and the Ottoman reforms, the Tanzimat. One was meant for the city as a cure, and the other was meant to the countryside also as a cure. And both gave amazing results. And the sad thing that we inherited that heritage in the aftermath of colonization, both the British and the French. We found ourselves with impeded policies, and I tell many examples in the book how those policies around the Islamic regions were impeded by colonization, and we tend to be guards on that impediment. We tend to tear down those policies, and as if we never were independent. And it's very strange, and it's very strange to my mind. Why would we do that to ourselves? But again, it's if we are going to back to Ibn Khaldun. Khaldun spoke about the colonized complex. So a person who was colonized for a long period of time may have this complex of guarding the inheritance of colonization and kind of colonize oneself, like the bird that keeps being in a cage of this book. I'll repeat this. So one of the goals of this book is to also shed a light on this issue in answering why this region seems to be in constant conflict. This is a question for ourselves as locals and for the international commentators who look at this region and find it very puzzling why this region keeps being in a conflict. And I think the reason why is we abandoned those policies, and we tend to stubbornly to look away from those policies. And I think those policies are important for the whole world, not only for a place like Syria in this region.
One thing I thought a lot about when I read the book was the experience we've had in this country and in a city like Bristol. We had factory cities. I mean, Bristol built in the 20th century on things like the tobacco industry and
Yes.
on the aerospace industry, and these were kind of philanthropic employers who helped build the city as well, providing hospitals, health services, museums, facilities, social clubs, and so on. What we've lost, I think, is those big companies who felt an attachment to the place they were working in, making money in, and contributing back to that place. We don't have that anymore.
Yes.
When you look at the way that American cities were forced to bid to have the big Amazon warehouses and headquarters and so on, often eye-wateringly offering large sums of money to do so. And yet the contribution of a company like that is not strong generally in a place as it was in the past. And I wonder whether there's, when you talked about the Islamic endowment you talked about, whether there's a way that we can kind of recover this in some way, where people and companies contribute to their place.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, charity is vital for the life of both the wealthy and the poor, and this is very important to understand. It's not when you build a charity, it's not about just those who benefit directly from the charity. It's about also the multiple goal, the interest of a multiple goals. And like you said, a company like Amazon who build and the campuses of the tech campuses of Facebook and so on, those create this vacuum that Kevin Lynch spoke about, both physically and economically. And they also tend to have their places on the expense of the countryside. So they go to a village and they disrupt the cycle there, and the cycle of the economy and the agriculture. People, of course, and this is also something that I discussed in relation to our country, when people are facing the choice between a tiring vocation like agriculture and an easy income like being employed in a warehouse like Amazon, the instant choice, the obvious choice is to go and work in Amazon. And we have to make those choices easy for people. We have to like I said, reconcile the three modes of settlement in a way that no big company is going to lure people to its own easy profit, because it wants to grow big and big and big for one multiple objective, one single objective, which is its own profit. And this is very very important, because like we've been discussing this whole discussion, it's about our survival. It's not about luxury anymore. It's about the fear of death.
You talk in the book about achieving the land of hope, and you refer particularly to Damascus and the past and that, and what you've learned from that. But I wondered what you'd learned from all the cities you visited, and what lessons they offer to how we can build this land of hope.
Yeah, so basically all of those cities build those many understandings that I speak about. Each city and each conversation, by the way, when people in festivals like yours and other platforms, when people ask a question they kind of push you towards finding a solution sometimes, and contemplating into an idea that you were discussing, and this in itself it's an act of refinement. It's just, you know, like, keep editing your own thought, and each city inspired me in that sense of how many things that we have in common, basically, which doesn't have to look like a cliche, but it's very true that we share those 5 fears. We share that those aspirations from our cities. We want the same thing in the sense of, you know, finding a place that could that we could root in, that we could, you know, finding a meaning towards of our lives, and so on. And Damascus is a capital. You know, it's just, it has a long history. It's the longest inhabited capital in the world, and it managed, because it mastered this act of balance between having agriculture around it, being in a center of trade, a world center of trade, with having charity all the time, with having, you know, having something to contribute to its visitors and to its citizens. And in that sense, it gave me just, you know, a sense of how wonderful the city is. It's not a local pride. It's just, you know, when you see all those cities around you and you go back to that city, you have the sense that that this poet, when I use this verse where the stranger sleeps on its own shadow, it's so true, and it gives you another light to look at the city.
I thought it was one of many inspirational stories you talk about, and also it's a very honest book as well, about the fears that we face, and about the vulnerabilities that cities have, and about how we move forward. So thank you very much for joining us today, Marwa. If you'd like to get a copy of Marwa's beautifully illustrated book, it's available from our partners at Waterstones, and there's a link below. Marwa, we hope very much that you'll be able to come to Bristol again, sooner rather than later. In the meantime, thank you again. We're very grateful for you for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me online and in person before, and I look forward towards that day that we are face to face again.